so excited to start this session on teacher competencies for the future of learning. I would really like to welcome Kavita Anand, Dr. Prerna Kumar, and Maya Menon. Kavita Anand is the founder, director of both Adhyayan Quality Education Services and Adhyayan Foundation. She was awarded the Ashoka Fellowship in 2015 for her social entrepreneurship in bringing quality to schools through leadership development. Over her career spanning 30 years, she has worked in organizations such as Aga Khan Education Services and the Ratan Tata Trust. Kavita started her journey by setting up a school herself, building up from pre-primary to high school. She calls building an education institution a science in itself. And through Adhyayan, she supports school leaders to build sustainable schooling systems and educators. Very warm welcome to you, Kavita. Moving on to Dr. Prerna. Dr. Prerna is a senior technical specialist at ICRW. Prerna leads Planet Girls Empowerment and Employability for Adolescent Girls, a research intervention aimed at enabling young girls to transition from education to employment. She has extensive experience in research, program evaluation, policy review, behavior change communication, capacity building, and advocacy. She has primarily worked in the field of public health with a focus on HIV, maternal and child health, sexual and reproductive health and rights, gender, health, and technology. That's so many things. And when I was reading this, I was like, this is life goals in itself. Welcome, Dr. Prerna Kumar. And lastly, we also welcome Maya Menon. She's the founder director of the Teacher Foundation. She has also been a member of the British Council India's policy think tank for continuing professional development. Her areas of professional experience include conceptualizing, designing, and implementing a wide range of school and teacher-related projects, such as the Safe and Sensitive Schools initiated in 2009. And she currently researches on standards for social and emotional learning for Indian schools. ISELF, which is the Indian Social and Emotional Learning Framework, can be used by schools, teachers, curriculum developers, mental health professionals, child social workers, as well as parents who want to foster SEL for children in India. Very, very warm welcome to all three of you. I'll quickly set the context for the discussion that's going to happen for the next 1 hour. In the last 2 years of the pandemic, we have seen educators actually give a whole new meaning to the terms COVID warriors and frontline workers. Amidst severe pressures owing to lack of infrastructure, demands from their own personal life, or struggling with their own skills, they've had to embrace the future of learning almost unceremoniously. Plus, adding to this has been the unprecedented monitoring by parents. So what does teacher capacity building really mean as we speak of learning and of the future? What kind of competencies do educators really need is really what we're going to focus on today. Let me put this in a slightly more personal kind of context. Educators are either glorified as the guru. It's almost like the mother paradigm where there needs to be compassion, knowledge, and this ever-flowing emotion or ever-flowing knowledge base, or they are discarded within the deficit paradigm, where they are seen as either non-motivated, almost robotic inside the education bureaucracy. I'll tell you a small story about what happened, or what I overheard rather, when I was doing a TOT, or training of trainers, in Gulbarga. 2 trainers were talking over breakfast, and one of them was from a very, very remote ITI from a place called Dandeli. It's close to Goa, and it's a men's ITI, limited resources, limited infrastructure. And this other person is from Gulbarga, and from the mainstream ITI there, where there is a lot of infrastructure, a lot of support in terms of what can be accessed. So the second trainer, the one with the better infrastructure, was saying, work is going on all right, but I'm just so tired. I finish the job and leave because whatever little we do is enough here. No one really cares much. To which the person from Dandeli responded, enough is a mindset. When we say enough, we limit our learners' future and their ability to dream. We dare not say enough. He said it in Kannada, but he said it in a very, very powerful way. Short sentence, we dare not say enough. And I was just flabbergasted because I was saying this is enough in that TOT, the design or whatever we had planned to deliver. I was actually in my mind saying this is enough. And then I heard this person saying we dare not say enough. And I'm now thinking, how do we really engineer this mindset? And how do we genuinely support educators who are actually the human beings behind the computer screens, within the classrooms, inside of this education policy. And we also want to talk about how we want to enable educators to shift their lenses from power to actually empower, from being inside of a system of power, where the curriculum, the syllabus, everything is handed to them, to themselves being, feeling that sense of power where they are creators, where they're co-creators of the experience that the learners get. And from training to learning, even the NEP says that 50 hours of teacher training or continuous professional development is a mandate, which is just 1 week of training, to that of learning. And also want to shift the lens from doing, because educators are seen as, like I said, robotic. They need to do too many things at the same time. And also the power structures kind of have shifted in this tech model, where parents are monitoring them, the learners are sometimes they're running away, they're muting them, they're turning off the laptops, or there's a definite dynamic shift in the power structure. So from continuously doing to being. So how do we really make this transition, and what does competency building, what does it even mean, while we talk about educators in this larger context? And before I start the first question, I would request all of you to keep on posting your questions in the chat box. Don't really wait for the Q&A in the end. We'll pick up the questions at the end, but please feel free to write your questions. And also, if you want to direct it to a particular panelist, please do write their name as well. So the first question is to all of the panelists. I request you to respond one after the other. The first question is, how do we understand the identity of an educator? What really makes a teacher or a trainer an educator? So can I go to Kavita Anand first?
Sure. Hi, thank you so much, Sushmita. That was a lovely way to start the session. So I think the root of educate is educare, right? The educator is supposed to be the one who draws out from the student whatever knowledge they have. And that's, I just want to say that for me, there's an additional element to it, which is that the educator is somebody who knows how to support the learner and knows when it is too much, when it is too little, and is constantly sort of at the balancing edge of being able to understand the person who's the learner, and is also very much a learner himself or herself. So I think that it's about the meeting of two learners really to support each other in a way. But the educator is the one who knows how to make that possible, rather than sort of just making it some sort of a transaction. It's a relationship that gets built.
Thank you for that. I love that. It's about two learners meeting. Great. Can we go to Prerna Kumar, please?
Thank you, Sushmita, and thank you, Kavita, for that great, defining an educator. At the outset, I must say I am not an educator and I am not an expert in the field of education. Having said that, and having worked on various programs with teachers, my own understanding of an educator is someone who, I think I see it from a lens of a larger human being, a human being who's not just restricted to that school and restricted to that relationship of learning, but like Kavita said, is also willing to learn themselves and is willing to facilitate that learning for everyone else, whether it's the students. And I think that sense of that I am a learner and I can reflect on myself, that reflexivity to me is an essential part of being an educator.
You've used the magic words. We love the word reflect and facilitate at Quest, and you've said those words. I'm so glad. Moving on to Maya Menon, please.
You asked the question, Sushmita, what makes a teacher or trainer an educator? I actually prefer the word teacher. I like education. I don't think there's really any other profession that it's body and soul, heart and mind, head and heart. So to answer your question, to me, teaching in its purest, most distilled form, living wholeheartedly and authentically, because I think everything that you know and can do and who you are you bring all of that into teaching. So teaching is as much and the world around you as it is about understanding and liking children and the craft and science of teaching. To quote, I think, German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who said that teaching is more difficult than learning because what teaching calls for is to let learn. And I think Kavita also sort of alluded to it when she said, the root form of education is educare. I think it's about letting another person learn, letting another younger person learn. I think that requires a huge level of maturity. And I think that is what teaching has to be. The main task of a teacher is to permit the student to learn, to feed their own curiosity. So I think that's what it is. Yeah.
Thank you, Maya. I actually resonate with that. To share that sense of power, to actually allow for that process for the learner to struggle and embrace the idea that you're trying to facilitate and make it their own, to actually take a step back and watch that happen, or to sometimes just make yourself invisible. That's really challenging process. I'm glad you spoke about that. My next question is to Kavita. So in a world that's buzzing with edtech startups, MOOCs, and remote learning models, what are the attitudinal shifts and new professional skills of an educator? And are there any concerns?
So the obvious answer, of course, is that you have to be sort of more tech enabled, because it kind of directly speaks to what you're saying. But actually, if you think about what it means to be tech enabled, is itself a big thing. So we've worked a lot with teachers who have had to move from not even having an email ID to suddenly teaching online. And it's been really interesting to see how does an adult learner pick up this entire business of, first of all, can I really do this? Can I start a virtual meeting on my own? To being able to say, what is it that I can do to relate to the students? Because I don't really know how to relate to windows that are closed or blank screens or black boxes. And that whole business of, therefore, what do I have to do to connect to the student? And if I simply, go to the whole idea that I deliver a lecture and that's it, then obviously that's not going to cut it with anybody. Nobody gets satisfied with that. So what we've seen is that teachers have had to, through this process of understanding what this new world looks like, they've had to understand the agency of the student a lot more. To recognize the fact that you can't really be the person providing all the information and expecting the other person to simply receive it like an empty vessel, but that you really do have to think about the fact that maybe within 10 minutes of you having said what you said, there has to be a point where you get something back. You get something done, some activity happening that makes the student feel that they're also part of what's going on. Otherwise, you've lost the person on the other side. So building that relationship, figuring out how to work synchronously and asynchronously, looking at what is it that to be aware of myself. They say that looking at yourself on the screen itself can be very disconcerting. So the whole business of what am I looking like right now as I'm speaking? Is my face looking peculiar? Is my hair undone? Is my home at the back visible? What do I see? If my kids are passing behind me, what are the students going to think? So there's all of that also in terms of self-awareness. How do I manage this entire business of being visible or being online? Then there's the whole business of technology and various platforms that have to be discovered. If a child doesn't have the ability to have a virtual meeting, then how do I reach out through an SMS or a WhatsApp? Or what can I do to reach out? How do I get back something from the child if they don't have tech? And I'm supposed to, the sort of tech that enables me to have a virtual meeting. If I'm supposed to do this through some other method, then what is it that I can do? How do I partner with parents to make something go through? If the dad has the phone or the mom has the phone, then what am I supposed to do? How do I get that across to them that this is important for their child to have access? There's so much that they've had to learn in terms of what are the human resources available in that area of where the child is living. Who can help if the child doesn't understand something? Is there someone I can reach out to for that? As a teacher, what is my ability to assess a child's work if this is the way in which this teaching learning is happening? So, I feel that there's been a sea change, and that's why it's so important that when we talk about what's going to happen once the schools reopen, and that's already happened, schools are reopening and people are going back in, can we begin to use all the learning that we've had over these last 16 months so that it's not completely fruitless, and say, how should now schools operate and what should they look like? So I think there's it's not just about saying that, okay, every page of the textbook should have the ability to take you to the Diksha platform. That's not really enough. I think it's also about the whole business of saying, does a teacher need to not know why they're teaching what they're teaching? How to make it exciting for a child? How do you begin to see the enabling of the aha for the child on a daily basis, so that children get invested and engaged, and the agency of the child is what you sort of engage with, rather than it becoming per force, because the child is seen as a student who has to go to school. You're kind of stuck, getting whatever you can get at the quality that you can get it. So it's there's a lot of learning that's happened. Let's see where this goes. Is going to be the big question. I hope that's answered your question. It's so much that's being learned that I think it's really quite tough to say just one thing that teachers have learned. There's a lot that's happened.
You're right. Like I've seen my mother struggle. She tries to teach sitar online, and she's almost reaching out to the screen to change the hand position. And the struggle is really real. Like you said, the self-awareness part, or struggling with the technology, the nervousness. Sometimes she's like, I don't know what to teach. I forget what to teach because I'm so nervous about where all the buttons go. That's just the starting point. But I'm mostly interested in what you said about synchronous, asynchronous learning, and how that's actually altering the whole blended learning paradigm as we understand it. And going back to schools is where we need to discover how asynchronous, synchronous can be rediscovered, repositioned, and made use of, like we've never made use of that, almost that dichotomy before. Now I want to go to Prerna Kumar and ask, so we've seen that there have been severe barriers to access, and especially among young women. And Quest has also done a lot of research around that area. And how do educators address these barriers of access, the gender divide, while they manage this pressure to teach online?
Thank you. That's a very pertinent question, Sushmita, because this is something that we've been struggling with for the longest time. And I think with COVID-19 coming in, it has just become so evident that how young girls and women do not have access to technology. Often when we talk about technology in India and how we've grown, we always talk about essentially the number of households that have phones and mobile phones. And that does not necessarily mean access to girls or access to women as far as mobile technology is concerned. We've seen and we've realized that it is less than 1/4 of the girls or women. I would stick to the adolescent girls because that's where my area of expertise is. We've seen that less than 1/4 of girls have access to technology, and we recently did a survey with some of our program participants, and we realized most girls are not able to continue their education. And this is a huge challenge. This is a huge challenge, not just for teachers, but I think the system has to respond. It cannot just be alone for a teacher to respond to an issue of access and lack of access. So I think it's kind of unfair to my mind that we put the onus of changing that power dynamic onto the teacher alone. And therefore, it becomes very, very important to then see who all are part of the system. Who are these critical stakeholders? It's the government, it's the education departments, it's parents who do not provide access. We do know that the fact that men have been at home has restricted their access further, because they are not able to talk to their peers either. And if there is a phone, it's the man of the household or it's the boy who gets access to it. So I think the problem is much larger than just holding the teacher responsible for bringing that change. Often we expect a lot from teachers, which again feels that that's kind of unfair. Also knowing that the teachers come from the same mindset and the same society. How do we forget that they are equally gendered in their thinking and their understanding, and they kind of give into that understanding. We've seen this in our work with a lot of government schools, for instance, even in Delhi, where most teachers come from a upper middle class kind of a background, where their own kids are possibly studying abroad or doing very well and undertaking professional courses. But when you talk to them about the girls who are studying in their classroom, they've literally given up on them. They're like, Inka kuch nahi ho sakta, you can't really do much, their parents don't want to invest. What do you really do about something like that? Now, the point is, you as a teacher, if you give up, then that's the end of it. And I remember, Sulabh, one of your colleagues, when we were doing a training together, he shared with the group of teachers who we were engaging with at that point, that if you know that you are the last hope, the last ray of hope for that student, then your entire perspective changes. And believe me, we did that training some 3 years back. And even till date, when I speak to those teachers who were part of that training, they still kind of stick on to that I am the last hope. So I think with teachers, it's important to really engage them in that process of reflection, in the process of reflection of understanding when they were a teenager, what did it feel like? When they were a child, what did it feel like? Did we really want to be the way we teach our children now? Also understanding that if we also give up on them, then there is literally no one to hold them. And I think the whole aspect of gender inequality and inequity has to be dealt with across structures. The government has to work on it. The parents have to work on it. We all have to contribute to make a more equitable space for girls to be able to even feel that they can share their aspirations, they can share their want to learn something. Most often, if a girl fails, parents just pull her out and get her married because they don't really see that she has the potential to learn and do anything else, because she's always seen in that reproductive role of us. Sorry, I've gone on like a long answer. I know there's limited time, so I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Prerna. So many pertinent points there. And I definitely agree that it's not, teachers, it's not the role of the teacher to solve this problem. It's a systemic correction that's required. I wouldn't even say correction. It's about a lot of more complex problems in a country like India. And, where do we build the system for access? How do we build that system for access? There are too many problematic questions here.
I think it's about shifting the power dynamics. I'm sorry for jumping in there.
Right. I'd like to now move to Maya Menon about, so while Prerna was also talking, I was wondering, what is this pressure on teachers looking like? This severe amount of pressure, as well as a lot of responsibility. So how do we now think of educator capacity building outside of workshops? Because it's kind of flown out of the window. Plus, it's not just about workshops. It's about a lot more engagement. And like Prerna was saying, a lot of reflection. And how does one really, build that into capacity building of educators? And how can continuous learning be engineered for the educator ecosystem?
Yeah, thanks, Sushmita. I'd like us to step back when you're talking about capacity building of teachers. I think we need to remember that the product of teaching, if I were to use it in air quotes, or the outcome of education, is actually a process in the human being, a process of growth of a person or persons that the teacher is responsible for. So I think we need to keep that always in mind. And which lessons remain through the years that a teacher engages with children and which are forgotten by the child or the student will you'll never know. The student may recognize the impact of a teacher years later, and a teacher herself or himself would never perhaps ever know. I think that's one thing we have to remember when we're talking about capacity building. So when I'm trying to grow and professionally or personally as a teacher, I need to recognize that whatever I'm doing, I'll never know how am I going to be impacting that child or that class and so on. So it's so hard to predict. Therefore, the influence that passes from a teacher to a student is possibly recollected years later. Suddenly there's an aha moment for that person who was a student of that particular teacher. So we need to keep that in mind, because therefore, and I sort of underscore that, therefore, feedback is critical for teachers. And that is something in our schooling and teacher training workshop system. Feedback is rarely provided, whether it is in school by internal people or by external people. There may be some inspections, but that's not feedback. And feedback is critical. We all need feedback. Doctors need feedback. Artists need feedback. Architects need feedback. Lawyers need feedback. Teachers most certainly do need feedback, because especially because we are in the business of developing young people. So I think that is one thing I want to emphasize on. So as I was alluding to the earlier, that teaching is such a whole person endeavor, and that any experience can be an opportunity for learning, growth, and reflection for the teacher. As a young teacher, decades ago, myself, there were no professional development workshops, as you were talking about, Sushmita, of any kind. There were only staff meetings. This was in the 80s. But as I tell people, I grew with my students. I grew in understanding the responsibility of being on the other side of the class, so to speak, to the potential and possibilities of children and what they can do. I experimented with approaches and methods without being stifled by conditioning practices that I saw my older colleagues do. So for me, it was personally, and I want to talk about it personally, because I think there are lessons for us for today also. So my professional development was completely self-directed, self-initiated. It included experimenting, with teaching, using poetry in my science teaching, or newspapers, taking students on field trips, etc. Going out on plays myself, concerts, traveling through across the country or in other parts of the world, and talking about it to my students. For me, all of that was CPD. That was CPD for me. And but of course, I didn't know the word CPD at that point of time. But I always returned from all these, journeys or explorations, personal explorations, more enriched, rejuvenated, energized, returning to school, especially after vacation and after traveling. But it was a different time that I taught, and it was a different world. And it was before technology and social media hyped up the noise of professional development. So today one is spoiled for choice, and schools and teachers in particular need to actively seek quiet contemplation and discernment to decide what they actually need by way of CPD. Otherwise, it's like a menu of in a restaurant, a very fancy menu, but you don't know what do you really need for the situation or context that you are working in. So that, and therefore it is important today, that we need to help teachers take responsibility for their own professional development. And there are a lot of opportunities for professional development at no cost or even low cost. So all the approaches that I use as a young teacher work. You can go for concerts, you can do your travels, you can read, you can etc. All of them still work. But today you can read blogs by teachers from across the world, blogs by school leaders from across the world. You can create your own blogs, you can join networks, communities of practice, attend webinars, virtual conferences, enroll for online courses. These are all ways in which you can actually learn apart from the so-called workshops that you mentioned. But I think and I'm just going to stop here. Continuous learning and CPD has to begin with the teacher. It can't be directed so much from outside. Okay, the school saying what teachers need to do. I need to know what I need to learn and how I need to energize or re-energize myself. We have to ask ourselves, what aspect of my professional practice do I want to improve, or I want to explore further, or I want to diversify into because I want to do something new or more challenging for myself. But also, it also behoves upon the school leadership, which could be government departments in the case of public schools and principals and school managements in the case of private schools, for them to decide what are the professional development opportunities that collectively teachers need to do also in order to improve the schools. So we have to look at professional development in two ways: the teacher's own development for herself or himself, as well as collectively the school wanting to know how do we foster and improve the quality of teaching learning that happens in our schools. And that may be a collective endeavor at the institution level. So I'm going to stop here. Sorry.
I really, really like the fact that feedback is an important aspect, and artists need feedback, teachers also need feedback. And what I'm thinking about is currently we're many organizations, including Quest, we're offering programs that are built online. So via the app, and multiple people are able to take the benefit and the learning at the same time. And even for teachers, we have a beautiful program called Master Coach, where they go through the modules in a blended learning fashion. And how do we integrate feedback? There's definitely an aspect of feedback, but how do we strengthen that feedback process? So actually there's that whole circle, and that whole circle becomes the second loop and the third loop and goes on and on. The other point is really about how we can enable educators and teachers to integrate their real life experiences back into the classroom, into their learning. And how do they even use something like social media? We're on social media so much, and we spend so much of our time there. How do we pull learning from social media and integrate that again back into the classroom? My next question is to Kavita, and that's about self-learning and learner-led models. So yesterday when we were talking, there was a lot of talk about how learner-centered model is not the most relevant thing anymore, and we should ideally move towards a learner-led model of learning and teaching. So if that's the way to go, and self-learning is also the thing that we really want to embrace, then how do we do this in the space of teacher capacity building? How do educators lead their own learning, and how do we develop learning experiences which help the teacher to lead the learning themselves?
It's quite obvious that you have to start with trusting the people to do it, right? I mean, I think that this is the whole problem, that somewhere we think that how can we do it sounds like, will they be able to do it? And I don't know if that's even a question. I mean, of course, everybody actually is a learner. It's like breathing. Can you stop breathing? You can't stop learning. So learning is happening whether you're aware of it or you're not aware of it, whether you know it consciously or not. It's part of your existence. And the whole thing is that, can you use that to be able to take it to the place where you want to take it? So let the learner decide what they need to learn is ideal, and that's the best case scenario. Now, to make such a thing happen, obviously requires you to rethink what kind of schools do you want, what kind of a society do you want, how do you want to develop this. Now, if you look at what's currently happening, 16 months of no school, what does it tell anyone about what is that institution's value in this space, right? If you can close down something and keep it closed, it tells you that it's not the most important thing. Like hospitals could not close down because people were dying, right? So there were like loads of other facilities or amenities that had to be kept open because they were seen as frontline facilities, amenities. Schools were not considered that. Teachers were not considered frontline workers. So if that is the case, it tells you that as a society, we think that schools are pretty, good to, nice to have, but not essential to have, like not essential to life, right? And so maybe the thing to look at is, are we creating schools as good creches where we can send the children, get them out of our hair for about like 5 to 6 hours, get them back home and then carry on living as normal, and what they learn, whether they learn, is of no real consequence to anybody. Is that how we want to treat the whole situation? And especially for the people who don't have access, because if you look at it, which schools were actually functioning, which schools moved online? They were all schools that were dealing with a certain class of society. That was a socioeconomic class of society that had the best learning experiences in the last 16 months. But 90% of the children had either 1 hour or 2 hours or less than that, sometimes just an SMS, and sometimes not even that. Sometimes like a television program provided as in lieu of schooling. Now, I think this is really problematic. I don't understand, how we can continue with that kind of an attitude, given that we all know that if there is supposed to be, progress, if we have to get all our population out of this, and when we say poverty line, what does it mean? Out of this feeling that if I can't earn today, I don't have anything to eat. I can't pay my rent. I'm homeless, right? And if you don't want to create a situation where most of the people in the country are constantly terrified about what the future holds for them if somebody falls ill, and if there is a serious illness, and you have to sell all the assets that you have just to be able to deal with that. I mean, that's really severe. So if most of the people in the country are in that space, then we really have to rethink, what does education mean? How quickly is this country going to be able to get to a place where children can independently learn? What does it mean for a person to be able to learn independently? Do we really have to have classrooms where teachers pick up a textbook and then explain every single word, starting from the first word in that chapter to the last word in that chapter? Do we need that? Why do we need that? When do we need it till? Do we need it in the 5th, 8th? Why? When a child is able to read and comprehend, why does the person have to explain that chapter to the child? And these are really fundamental questions I'm asking. This is like stuff that's been discussed to death, but it's still a question. If we were to really begin to think about what do we want, like if we had every child, supposing 16 months ago, we had a situation where schools closed down, but every child had access to a library, a public library. If they had access to resources for learning, and they had something that was available in all the public spaces of their villages, of their cities, of their towns, where they had access to whatever they needed, if they were able to get it, would they need a school? No. Would they stop learning? No. So if we want to get to a place where children can continue to learn, if we want to get to a space where that's like, the future, because it's going to be disruptive and there's going to be more pandemics and more such cases of schools closing and opening. We still have it in landslides, in earthquakes, and in monsoon and pollution. Delhi schools just closed down for pollution. So what is it that we want to do there? And if we want to have a situation where children can continue to learn, what do we design as learning as a learning space for our students? Has to be thought through. Secondly, I think it's not just about cognition and learning, subject matter. It's also about the whole business of who's there to enable children to play. Play is, I think, the most important part of being a child, right? I mean, if you can learn through play, that's brilliant. But if you have some spaces to play, that's really, really important. I think the one very exciting thing that happened was we had a very good conversation between a school in Delhi and a school, some children from Goa. And the children in Goa said, well, there was the school closed down, but because it closed down, we didn't really have anything to do. So we went and we would go to the mountains and go to the waterfalls and have a look at what's happening in the fields and help, our parents in the fields. And so suddenly the children in Goa said, gosh, in Delhi said we didn't have access. We couldn't move out of our homes. And here these children are able to go out and do a whole bunch of things. And suddenly it felt like, what does it say about just the social emotional spaces that are available to a child who's stuck inside a house versus a child who has a field to go walk in, and what does it actually mean? So we've got to be able to understand that if, like we're saying, learning is available everywhere and learning should be available everywhere. The village should be your classroom, or the city be your classroom, or the world be your classroom. How would we like to design our schooling and our learning spaces? What do we want to do to enable children to learn continuously? How quickly can we make them independent learners? These are the questions we have to answer quickly and put them in place in the next year or so that we can then have that resilience that we talk about and make learning come right on the top of what's possible to continue to do.
I agree with you about the trust part, and actually trusting to allow, not even allow is a very bad word, trusting to enable or invite them to lead their own learning processes as adult learners as well as young learners, like you were mentioning. I want to go to Maya Menon next and talk about how to actually build connections in this sometimes online, sometimes offline world. And we were talking about synchronous, asynchronous, blended, all of that. But how can real connections be built in a world where things are both online and offline? So between the educator, the learner, the content, and also helping young people build connections within their own peers. How can these connections be made possible? What is your opinion?
I think it's a very complex question that you posed. How do you make those connections? I think you make connections when there is a will as well as a need to make those connections. And also then you look for avenues and opportunities to do it. Now, in today's world of technology, there are lots of opportunities to make connections, connection with colleagues, connection with peers from other parts of the world, and helping children also do the same, making connections. So technology in itself has been useful, but as Kavita mentioned, it has just reached out to a very small segment of our school population, teachers as well as children, because the vast majority of children in our urban, semi-urban, or rural, and particularly rural background have not had those opportunities to make those connections. So how do we do it? I think technology in today's world, technology definitely helps. You could have your, as I said earlier, your webinars, your virtual conferences, your one-on-one peer discussions. All of that can be done online today, whether it's on Zoom or Google Meet or any of the other platforms. But wherever you're talking about connections have to begin with interactions between people, teachers with teachers, teachers with children. Those are essentially, those are the meaningful connections, and connections have to be done beyond just curriculum. It's not about I'm connecting with my class in order because I've got to teach this chapter X in science or chapter Y in mathematics and so on. It's not about that. It is about that I genuinely want to find out and engage with my class. I think it comes from that intent, as I said, and that's where I think we really lose out, particularly in our country, because we have got so conditioned. When I say we teachers have got so conditioned to just teaching to the textbook, teaching the subject, teaching the curriculum, rather than the child and the student. And I think that is where we have to unlearn so much of what we've got. We need to question everything that we've done so far in our schools. And I think that is a tall order, because we need to have built capacity of teachers to think, because they've only all these years, decades, several decades, past 70, 75 years, we've only been asked to carry out orders of the government, orders of the school board, orders of the school management, and so on. I personally talked about my own personal experience as a very young teacher, and I taught for many years in Delhi, in a large school in Delhi. before I went into teacher development and teacher education. And I was lucky. I had a head who just let me do whatever I wanted to do. And because and we had a young group of teachers, colleagues who did interesting things, but it didn't mean that other people did not, they were sitting in the staff rooms and often knitting also. It isn't as if they were looking at professional development. So we have to help create a system in our country to help teachers learn or relearn everything for themselves. I think that's, and a lot of our work at the Teacher Foundation, what we do is actually help teachers experience a new kind of learning. Because teachers, there's a lot of research from across the world that says teachers teach the way they have been taught. And if you have to change the way teachers teach, you have to help them learn in a different way. It all comes back to learning. And in order to learn in different ways, you need to have people who will help teachers learn with meaning, with relevance, with understanding. And that is a connection. That's a connection between educators, educators who are in teacher development, teacher education versus educators who are classroom teachers. And then teachers know, okay, this is how I can replicate these experiences for my students in my classroom. So I think that's where, and therefore I want to underscore the importance of feedback. Teachers need feedback on how do they plan lessons. They need feedback in what kind of questions they ask in class. They need feedback on how they enable children to collaborate and learn. You talked about learner-led learning. Basically, if you're talking about learner-led learning, it's about focusing on learning rather than even the learner. We're looking at moving from teacher-centered to learner-centered to learning-centered, because when you're talking about learner-led, it has to be focusing on learning. Children will take responsibility and accountability if the teacher has let go and allowed them to take control of their learning. And that's what we need to do. And that's where the human connections that happen between teachers, students is so vital. And it has to be based on mutual respect and a sense of accountability on both parties side, both the teacher's side as well as student side. Students have to feel responsible for their learning. Teachers have to feel accountable for ensuring that children are learning. So sorry, I'm going to stop there.
Please don't be sorry. It was so nice to keep on listening. To me, what really resonated is the faith that you build in a teacher as an adult when they experience a new learning system. So when I first started doing online learning, or when I started exploring blended learning, it was such a new experience, or even experiential learning for that matter. I felt like, oh, finally there's a community, I belong, I understand, and I can even do this differently. So those aha moments are perhaps what really triggers one to get inspired enough to try it back in the classroom. And yes, I completely resonate with that. So I'll just go with my last question before I open it out for Q&A.
Yeah, so can I add something to this conversation? Because I think it's fundamentally important. I think that one of the things that tends to happen is teachers think that what has to be taught has to be limited to whatever it is that is being tested. And that is the biggest problem that comes in the way of that relationship being built, where a child is dying to know a lot more, has thousands of questions, but the teacher constantly sort of says, but this is it. This is what you have to do. I've actually seen a child having done more than, what the teacher had given as classwork, and the teacher saying, rub it out because I haven't yet allowed you to write it, right? So that's the kind of, the kind of barriers that we have where actually children are raring to go. They are way ahead of so many teachers. There are children who know so much more because they have access to more information. But we tend to have this hierarchical sort of thing of this is a teacher, that is a student, And I think that kind of, if we were to simply say, is this possible that the people who run the schools, the principals, the leaders, the people who are the system leaders, if they start asking the simple question, which is that can the child read with understanding? Can the child comprehend? How much is the child reading? Is the child reading beyond the textbook? Is the child reading a lot of stories and other books? Is the child reading different kinds of texts? If those are the questions, rather than how many children are attending, is the teacher attending, what is it that you're doing in the classroom, and have you got your lists of people done, sorted? If that is the kind of question that is asked, we could really see shift happen. So if you want movement in teachers, get the leadership to change its approach to those teachers and start asking them the kind of questions that make it really possible for teachers to start saying it's not about the test. It's not about the percentage of children getting 100% in the 10th standard. It's about whether children can learn. That's what's important.
Okay, I've been told this can be the last question. So thinking a lot about parent engagement, and Prerna was also talking about how parents have become allies in the process, and they're also monitoring and adding a lot of pressure to teachers like never before. But we should also think of parents as allies, really, and how can they really become allies in these teachers' success and effectiveness of the learning process as a whole.
Is it for anybody? Okay. I'll go, and then maybe Kavita have something to say too. So I think with parents, particularly, whether I've seen this as a trend, a shift from when I was a teacher, active teacher, to now. And this happens even with government schools. It's not just with private schools, that teachers are increasingly defensive about dealing with parents. They always feel that parents are troublemakers, parents are going to complain, parents are going to criticize everything that I'm doing, and so on. So they wear almost sort of wear an armor when they've got to deal with parents. And I think that has to shift, and that can shift only by, first of all, building the teacher's sense of confidence in herself, confidence in her work, and the institution, of course. I think that is where, because therefore teachers always hold the parents at arm's length. They don't want to engage too much with the parents, but parents eventually are not bad people. Parents have the best interests of their child or children at heart. So I think we have to help teachers recognize that parents, even the most difficult or fussy parent, wants the best for their child. And we also as teachers want the best for our students. So I think we have to change that equation and mindset. And that comes from schools regularly helping teachers know how to communicate and engage with parents without getting defensive, without getting offensive also, because sometimes they could attack the parent also. You don't want that. So how do you have a conversation between two concerned adults, one a parent, another a teacher, about their child? I think there's so much a scope for growth and a certain sense of sort of a feeling of confidence and being on a collaborative journey. I think that's where we have to stop looking at parents as the enemy.
Yeah, I think that if we were to look at the teacher as somebody who is the most capable person and sort of say, this is your journey and you tell us what you need, that's the best way to start. Ask the teacher, what do you need?
I think golden words said there when we talk about teacher competency building. Ask the teacher what they want to know. Ask the whole school system what the school system wants to do and how do they want to make that leap. Thank you so much for joining in and for this super insightful conversation. I really enjoyed myself.